Buongiorno tutti i miei amici, in particolare Carrie Cannon, grazie per la tua donazione molto generosa. Thank you for your generous donation to APT and for sponsoring another Impassioned video essay, this time on Italy in the 1970s. I have done an above average amount of reading into the subject. I will do my best to deliver a concise video essay on one event that encapsulates the decade: the kidnapping of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro in March of 1978. Allora, spoke too much Italian to go any further without a glass of vino. So grab your vino. Yes, the tannins, all in the tannins. And let's talk. Avanti. So to really get a sense of what was going on in the 1970s, you have to go all the way back to the end of World War II. The Italian people, including Italian women for the very first time, voted to make Italy a republic. I love democracy. A center-left party called the Christian Democrats would hold a majority in parliament for the next 30 years. Now, there was a real concern, especially the United States, that Italy would turn red or fall into communism. Italy entered into what is called Gli anni del piombo, the years of lead, beginning with student protests in the late 1960s and spreading all the way through the midpoint of the 1980s. This was a period of unrest from both extreme left militant terrorist groups and extreme right militant terrorist groups. But it's the year 1970 when we see the beginning of what would become one of the most notorious terrorist groups ever to exist on Italian soil, the Red Brigades, or the Brigate Rosse, or the BR. These were extreme left-wing communist revolutionaries. Their main targets were usually lawyers, law enforcement, journalists, and politicians who either spoke out against them or got in their way. Now let's talk about Aldo Moro. Chin chin. Now, Aldo Moro had been involved with the Christian Democrats since their inception. He served as prime minister twice over his career in the 1960s and the 1970s. By 1976, the Christian Democrats were faced with a major upset when the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, won an unprecedented 34% of the votes. Aldo Moro emerges one of the most prominent supporters of what was going to be termed the historic compromise, an attempt to reach across the aisle and set aside some of their differences. Also worth noting that both world superpowers at the time, the USA and the USSR, were not a fan of the historic compromise. In the face of all this pressure, Moro loudly advocated for this compromise to go through. This was totalmente inaccettabile for the Red Brigades. Whew. This takes us to the morning of March 16th, 1978. Aldo Moro is in his motorcade driving through a quiet residential neighborhood in northern Rome. A group of BR militants storm his convoy, murder his 5 bodyguards, force Moro out of his car, and drive away to an undisclosed location that supposedly no one will ever know exactly where it was. The BR immediately claimed responsibility for the kidnapping and demanded the release of several BR prisoners in exchange for Moro's life. The government immediately responded that they will not negotiate with terrorists, even though several prominent members of the government, including the president of Italy at the time, opposed that stance. And this is where things start to get a little complicated. Moro sent letters while he was in prison. He urged the government in those letters to prioritize life and come to some sort of agreement with his captors. Many members of his own party reported that there was absolutely no way this reflected Moro's actual beliefs. Moro's family objected to this line of thinking. Worth noting, there continues to be suspicion that some people in power in both Italy and in the United States knew where Moro was being kept. Obviously, the extent of that knowledge is highly disputed, but there is significant evidence, including personal statements from some US officials, that they were willing to sacrifice Moro's life to preserve Italian stability, whether that means by not negotiating with terrorists or by not allowing this historic compromise to go through. Depends on who you ask. So, on May 9th, 1978, 54 days after he had been captured, Aldo Moro was escorted out of the place where he'd been held. He was ordered to get into the trunk of a car and cover himself with a blanket. His captors opened fire. They parked the car in a small street in the city center and abandoned it to be discovered very shortly thereafter with Moro's body still in the trunk. The death of Aldo Moro had sent shockwaves through Italy. It ultimately marked the beginning of a long, drawn-out end to the Red Brigade's reign of terror. It also marked the crumbling of the historic compromise that Aldo Moro had fought so hard to push through. So, not surprisingly, some remarkable art has come out of this tragedy, including the 2003 film Buongiorno Notte, or Good Morning Night, directed by Marco Bellocchio, and the one-man theatrical experience called Corpo di Stato, or Body of State, by Marco Bagliani. This is the tip of the iceberg. I don't want to keep you here against your will. Maybe that was an insensitive joke to make. Thank you again so much for tuning in. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Arrivederci. Arrivederci, Roma.